February 1943, after the humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass, American arms were a name in need of redemption. Within weeks, a single uncompromising commander reforged the U.S. Second Corps and, on the Desert Fox's own ground, began to turn Rommel's rules of mobile war back on their creator. What did Erwin Rommel say, in private, when George S. Patton outthought him on the sands he once owned?
February 19th to 24th, 1943. The Kasserine Pass campaign left the U.S. Second Corps shaken and the Allied front in Tunisia dangerously rent. American units, many inexperienced in desert combined arms and command cohesion, were driven from positions and suffered heavy losses in men and materiel. The blow was more than tactical. It was a psychological shock to the Army of the United States, a stark lesson that mobile warfare demanded not only courage, but doctrine, discipline, and supply. Allied commanders immediately recognized that the American formations in North Africa had to be remade into a force that could both absorb and deliver armored shock. The diplomatic and military fallout forced swift command changes.
On 6 March 1943, Lieutenant General George S. Patton assumed command of the battered Second Corps. His arrival was ordered as a direct corrective to the failures at Kasserine. Patton's immediate task was not strategy in the abstract, but the restoration of discipline. Clean uniforms, restored chain of command, rigorous training schedules, and above all, rebuilding morale. Yet Patton moved beyond parade ground fixes. He demanded tactical change. He reintroduced aggressive reconnaissance, tighter coordination between armor and artillery, and relentless offensive drills aimed at reducing the kinds of command paralysis that had proved fatal at Kasserine. Within weeks, these changes translated into battlefield confidence and measurable gains.
Patton was no doctrinal isolationist. He studied German blitzkrieg doctrine and Rommel's operational playbook, not to copy slavishly, but to counter and improve. He prized speed, surprise, and combined arms, yet he paired these with a renewed obsession for logistics, fuel, ammunition, and forward maintenance that would let an armored punch be sustained rather than dissipated. At El Guettar and the set pieces that followed, Patton applied Rommel's style mobility while plugging the logistical holes that had undone earlier thrusts. The result was an American armored force that could think like Rommel, but supply itself like an industrialized nation. And that combination changed the tactical calculus in Tunisia.
Patton did not simply bark orders. He rewired a broken system. Between 6 March and late March 1943, he enforced discipline, reorganized staff relationships, tightened reconnaissance cycles, and insisted that combined arms, infantry, tanks, artillery, and engineers practice together until their timing was as automatic as a clock. Crucially, Patton prioritized logistics. Fuel lines were shortened, maintenance crews pushed forward, and ammunition stocks were counted like cash. These were not cosmetic changes, but structural repairs that closed the gap between bold maneuver and sustainable offense. Within 3 weeks, Second Corps was no longer a collection of raw units, but a coordinated, mobile instrument, ready to probe, fix, and then exploit enemy weaknesses rather than crumble at the first shock.
From 23 March into early April 1943, at El Guettar and nearby engagements, American formations tested their new cohesion. Patton's Second Corps, reinforced by armor and artillery and better supplied, bluntly contested German armored probing. Rather than wait defensively for the Desert Fox to strike, Patton's formations executed aggressive local counterattacks, calibrated artillery barrages, and armored flanking moves designed to disrupt German tempo. The result was not a single dramatic breakout, but a steady attrition of Axis offensive options. German armored counterthrusts were met with coordinated firepower and supply-backed persistence. El Guettar showed that the U.S. had begun to fight mobile warfare on terms that would embarrass an opponent who had once taught those rules.
Erwin Rommel had long used speed, deception, and audacity to turn the desert into a forced march of surprises. By late March 1943, his intelligence picture showed something different. American armored columns no longer dissolved under shock, but counterpunched with coordinated artillery and persistent logistics. Rommel's headquarters received reports of tighter American defensive belts, faster counter-reconnaissance, and resupplied units that kept coming back for the fight. Those on Rommel's staff noted a change in tempo, not just the Americans' willingness to attack, but their capacity to sustain it. For a commander who prized exploit over attrition, the shift was significant. The student was beginning to apply the teacher's tactics, but with a supply system Rommel increasingly could not match in that theater.
The defining turn was not a single telegram or quote, but a tactical moment. When Patton anticipated an armored Axis and interposed his forces with defensive depth, counter-battery fires, and a timely armored counterstroke that fixed and rolled up the attacker. That pattern repeated in set pieces across Tunisia, where Rommel expected to find disordered American columns. He increasingly found prepared positions, timely resupply, and mechanized units able to switch from withdrawal to counterattack without waiting weeks to reorganize. The consequence was operational. Axis options narrowed, losses in armor and initiative mounted, and Rommel faced a theater where speed without fuel and logistics would no longer yield decisive outcomes. In private notes and post-action commentary, some German officers acknowledged the growing professionalism of American armored operations in Tunisia.
Patton's battlefield gains in Tunisia were inseparable from a logistical push that often goes unseen in dramatic retellings. In March 1943, the Americans began to shorten resupply lines, prioritize forward maintenance, and stage fuel in ammunition dumps where they mattered, not weeks behind the front, but within hours of the next operation. Motor pools and repair crews were no longer rear area luxuries, they were offensive weapons. This made the U.S. armored formations less vulnerable to the classic Rommel trick, a lightning thrust that outran its supplies. Put simply, mobility without sustainment is a brittle tactic. Patton learned to combine shock with supply, and that combination changed the desert's arithmetic.
Patton's improvements were not isolated. Artillery observers, air liaison officers, and armored commanders synchronized fires with growing precision. The American 9th and 12th Air Support elements began to be used in close coordination with ground advances, reconnaissance spotting, and interdiction that made German armored counters far more hazardous. Where Rommel had exploited fleeting gaps in Allied air coverage, by late March, the Allies' improving air-ground integration and suppressive artillery made those gaps smaller and more lethal to an attacker. The cumulative effect was tactical attrition inflicted at the moment of decision, exactly the place Rommel had once thrived. Crucially, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was not present for the climactic set pieces in late March. He had departed Tunisia for Germany on 9th March 1943, leaving von Arnim and others to conduct the campaign. Rommel's absence removed the immediate hand of the theater's most audacious practitioner, and his deputies often favored more cautious or administrative approaches. The man who had turned audacity into doctrine watched Tunisia's later battles from a distance. His prior presence had skewed the tactical equation, and his absence allowed Allied forces, now learning and adapting, to exploit a continuity of command and logistics he might have countered differently. That strategic absenteeism is a key factor in why the Americans could apply Rommel's methods more effectively.
Patton and his subordinates learned to neutralize Rommel's classic tools: rapid flanking, shock by concentrated armor, and daring infiltration. At El Guettar and subsequent engagements, commanders used deliberately layered defenses, forward screening elements to detect movement, mobile anti-tank teams to blunt spearheads, and pre-registered artillery to smash momentum. When armor did break through, it encountered staged reserves ready to roll up exposed flanks. These were not improvisations, but doctrinal adjustments made in real time. Patton's forces were rewriting the playbook on how to fight mobile warfare in a theater where air parity and supply increasingly favored the Allies.
The practical consequence of these changes was strategic compression. Axis initiative in Tunisia narrowed, as German and Italian units could no longer assume that lightning maneuver would necessarily decide battles. Attrition mounted not only from direct combat losses, but from an inability to reliably replace fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in the face of Allied interdiction and shortened supply lines. The Feser shifted from favoring audacious, isolated thrusts to rewarding sustainment, combined arms preparation, and operational depth. For Rommel, a commander who owed much of his myth to surprise and exploitation, the desert was no longer a playground where speed alone could beat method. Contemporary after-action reports and later histories record this narrowing of Axis options in blunt terms.
On 23 March 1943, the 10th Panzer Division struck near El Guettar, in one of the first real tests of Patton's retooled Second Corps. The German armored formation attempted a classic breakthrough: speed, shock, and massed armor, only to meet a U.S. defense that had been rehearsed for that very moment. Pre-registered artillery concentrations, tank crews trained to fight hull down, and riflemen instructed in anti-tank ambushes. The result was not an instant breakthrough, but costly, close fighting, in which coordinated American firepower and timely counterattacks blunted the panzer's momentum. The engagement forced German commanders to measure American capability not by one rash encounter, but by a growing pattern of prepared resistance that bled Axis tempo.
Patton's reforms rippled downward. Non-commissioned officers and junior leaders who had trained under the new regimen now exercised initiative at platoon and company level. Forward observers called in killer barrages. Tank commanders coordinated with infantry to form immediate anti-tank zones, and maintenance crews kept damaged Shermans rolling back into action within hours. This decentralized competence under a decisive higher command turned localized emergencies into manageable setbacks rather than campaign-ending disasters. Where earlier American columns might have dissolved,
Now echelon leadership and practiced junior officers held lines long enough for counterattacks to form, a tactical inversion of the desert legend.
Intelligence shaped outcomes. Allied signals intelligence and improved reconnaissance began to narrow the surprises that once fed Rommel's campaigns. Ultra-intercepts and more systematic aerial and ground reconnaissance gave Allied commanders clearer windows into Axis dispositions. Reconnaissance reports eroded the information advantage the Afrika Korps had exploited. The result was predictable movement rather than instantaneous shock. Rommel's favorite gambits lost potency when they were met by prepared positions and pre-planned interdiction. In short, where the Desert Fox once operated with a veil of uncertainty, the Allies steadily replaced that veil with a map of likely enemy options.
Rommel's doctrine prized decisive thrusts, but each thrust consumed tanks, fuel, and spare parts at brutal rates. As Axis supply lines tightened and Allied interdiction bit, the cost of German audacity rose. Patton's forces, by contrast, increasingly fought with a predictable supply tail. Ammunition was there when needed, fuel depots were within reach, and workshop bays pushed forward to salvage rolling stock. The operational math changed. German success required low-loss exploitation. Allied progress required sustained expenditure. Over time, losses that a blitzkrieg might have absorbed in 1940 could not be replaced in Tunisia in 1943. Attrition, not a single tactical defeat, did the strategic work.
Rommel left for Germany on 9 March 1943, a departure that denied the theater its most audacious strategist during the campaign's decisive weeks. In subsequent private correspondence and later memoir fragments, German officers recorded a tone of begrudging respect for the Americans' rapid learning curve. They noted a force that had shed its early inexperience and now combined mobility with sustainment. Contemporary German staff commentaries remark on the surprise of seeing U.S. armored columns sustain themselves and counterpunch. Whatever Rommel's private words, filtered through later recollections and the fog of propaganda, the evidence on the ground told a clear story. The U.S. Army in North Africa had moved from student to competent practitioner, and that transition changed the theater's operational logic.
By April 1943, Tunisia ceased to be a string of heroic charges and became, instead, a grinding test of endurance. Patton's reformed units no longer expected a single decisive breakthrough. They prepared for sustained pressure, rotating frontline elements, conserving combat power, and trading space for time when needed to preserve key formations. Every local counterattack that stopped the German thrust imposed attritional costs the Axis could not easily replace. Tanks with pierced fuel tanks, crews missing because of mechanical failures, and ammunition caches expended on hurried counterfires. Strategically, those cumulative losses tightened the vice. The Axis could still strike with audacity, but its capacity to sustain success against a methodical, supplied opponent was dwindling. The war in Tunisia became a ledger of supply, repairs, and incremental advantage rather than a set-piece duel between singular geniuses.
German pressure in Tunisia was compounded by frictions within Axis command and the increasingly fragile state of Italian formations under heavy strain. German units had to stretch to plug gaps and support faltering allies, diverting resources that might otherwise have gone to decisive operations. Supply convoys became vulnerable,
Coordination between panzer elements and supporting infantry grew uneven as exhaustion and spare part shortages bit. This fragmentation played into Allied hands, where once Rommel could rely on rapid, integrated thrusts, he now faced a patchwork opposition and a thinning logistical web. On campaign maps, the area of real German initiative constricted visibly. What was left was a gamble, daring, but with diminishing strategic return.
Patton's tactical reforms in Second Corps did not remain isolated. Other U.S. and Allied formations observed, adopted, and adapted those methods. Better combined arms drills, quicker forward maintenance, and more aggressive interlocking defenses. What began as local improv became theater doctrine, a practical set of techniques shared across corps and armies. That diffusion mattered. When one formation learned to hold and then counterpunch, neighboring units found it easier to cooperate in coordinated offensives. The net effect was multiplied combat power, not because of a single leader's charisma, but through the spread of practical, repeatable techniques, practice drills, pre-registered fires, and forward logistical staging. In operational terms, Patton's lessons scaled upward and multiplied Allied options across Tunisia.
By late April 1943, the strategic picture in Tunisia converged toward inevitability. Axis forces, depleted in materiel and hamstrung by supply, found their operational choices narrowed to desperate local counterattacks, withdrawal, or surrender. Allied superiority in sustainment and growing competence in mobile operations made prolonged Axis initiative impossible. The Desert Fox's old advantage, the ability to turn audacity into strategic gain, had been undercut not by myth-busting single events, but by a systemic inversion. The student had learned to use speed and shock while also ensuring none of those gains were thrown away for lack of fuel, ammunition, or repairs. The final collapse in North Africa would be the sum of many such refusals. Refused breakthroughs, repaired tanks returning to battle, and an Allied operational culture that matched audacity with logistics.
By early May 1943, the Allied offensive from west and east began to close the coastal corridor that still linked Axis forces to the sea. The Allied pinchers were not a single grand maneuver, but a sequence of coordinated thrusts. Montgomery's 8th Army from the east, Allied 1st Army from the west, and Patton's 2 Corps pressing where it could, that steadily reduced German freedom of movement. Each captured supply point and port further shortened Allied lines and lengthened Axis ones. Each interdicted convoy increased the logistical strain on German units that still sought operational surprise. What looked like local advances became a strategic strangulation. The Axis perimeter in Tunisia shrank until it offered no real avenue for decisive maneuver, leaving bold counterstrokes increasingly costly and less likely to change the outcome.
The Tunisian campaign ended in a collapse of Axis capability rather than a single-pitched defeat. Tunis fell on 7 May, and within days the remaining coastal pockets were untenable. On 13 May 1943, Axis forces in North Africa formally surrendered, yielding vast numbers of prisoners and removing the Axis foothold from the continent. The surrender was the cumulative product of the very shifts documented earlier: Allied improvements in logistics, combined arms integration, air-ground coordination, improved intelligence, and the diffusion of tactical practices, many of them hardened by Patton's emphasis on sustainment and tempo. In short, a theater that once rewarded audacity now punished it when audacity outran supply and situational awareness.
Did Rommel admit defeat or utter a single pithy line when Patton's methods began to bite? The contemporary record offers no neat, universally authenticated soundbite. Rommel left Tunisia on 9 March 1943 and watched the campaign's decisive weeks from Europe. His private correspondence and post-war memoir fragments and the testimony of German staff officers convey a grudging professional respect for a force that had rapidly learned the desert's harsh grammar. German staff commentaries and later campaign histories record surprise at the Americans' ability to marry mobility to sustainment and to use combined arms coordination to blunt traditionally successful German maneuvers. In short, historians find evidence of admiration and operational acknowledgement, not a single dramatic quotation, that the student had become a practitioner capable of matching the desert fox in the desert's most important terms.
The final lesson of Tunisia was structural. A modern industrial army that learned quickly and organized its logistical tale could neutralize the operational genius of even the most daring commander. Patton did not merely mimic Rommel, he internalized the Desert Fox's principles of speed and surprise and fused them with the Allies' growing advantages in sustainment, air support, intelligence, and mass production. The result altered the operational ecology of North Africa and presaged later campaigns in Europe where Allied material depth and refined combined arms doctrine proved decisive. If there was a single sober appraisal Rommel might have made, it would be that battlefield skill without sustainment is fragile, and that, in Tunisia, the Americans learned to be both fast and endlessly supplied. That is the moment the student surpassed the teacher, not by myth, but by practical, verifiable change on the ground.